But celebrity status is nothing if not fickle. At the very peak of its fame, the spotlight moved on, and Flying Scotsman's star began to wane. In 1935, Nigel Grassley unveiled a radically new streamlined engine, the A4 Pacific. 3 years later, one of them, Mallard, would run at 126 miles per hour, eclipsing Flying Scotsman's record. But by September 1939, there were more pressing concerns. Britain, once again, was at war. World records and glamorous travel were forgotten. Flying Scotsman, along with the rest of Britain's fleet of steam engines, was put to work in the service of the country and largely ignored. The demands of war put severe strains on the railways, leaving them completely run down, and in 1948 they were nationalised. The LNER disappeared, and Flying Scotsman acquired a new owner, British Rail, and a new number. Then, as Britain moved into the 50s, an economic boom put money into people's pockets, and consumer spending began to change the way they lived. Changes in travel were part of the revolution. The railways faced a new and potentially lethal competitor. The number of cars in Britain grew from just over 20,000 in 1930 to almost 2 million in 1960. (1959) was a key year. It was the year the first motorway opened and the car that became the icon of the road, the Mini, was launched. The road offered a freedom that the railway couldn't match. While young people going on holiday in Cornwall in 1929 had to use the train, those in 1959 went on their scooters. The consequences for Britain's railways were enormous. They began to lose passengers and freight. Financial losses mounted. If they were going to survive, they would need to modernise. And in 1955, they published a modernisation plan. Steam would go. For Flying Scotsman, this was a death sentence. Along with most of Britain's steam engines, it would be scrapped. Towards the end of 1962, British Rail announced that Flying Scotsman would go to the breakers' yard in the new year. The locomotive had been around for 40 years, but this was a defining moment in its history. A group called Save Our Scotsman tried to buy it, but couldn't get near British Rail's asking price of £3,000, £50,000 in today's money. Then at the 11th hour, in stepped a very rich steam enthusiast, Alan Pegler.
Alan Pegler was the son of a wealthy industrial family in Nottinghamshire, and from a very young age he was obsessed with railways. And when he acquired a private pilot's licence, aged just 17, he used it to chase trains, always his beloved LNER. In the war, he flew Skua dive bombers for the Fleet Air Arm, and after the war, he found himself trying to run Northern Rubber, his family company, which effectively ran itself, so he found himself in an office, staring out of the window at the railway, with not a great deal to do.
Alan Pegler had known Flying Scotsman from the beginning.
After the First War, the early 1920s, that engine, Flying Scotsman, was on exhibition at Wembley. And I was taken by an uncle or somebody or other to that exhibition, sat in the driver's seat of that engine, and it was to me a tremendous thrill, and I got a great kick out of all that.
Alan Pegler had been involved in railway preservation from the early 1950s. When he heard that Scotsman was about to disappear, he dug deep into his pockets. He bought it.
If nobody was going to do anything about it, I wanted to, but it seemed to me to be quite wrong that this famous class of engine should all get scrapped.
I can remember when my father bought the engine. I was 9 years old, and he came upstairs and he sat on my bed and he said, "Today I bought a steam engine." And he was sparkling. He really was. It was like a little boy who had just been out and bought a great big toy.
The whole idea of buying an express passenger locomotive from British Railways was something completely new. Nobody had ever done it before. It would be like going to British Airways today and asking to buy a jumbo jet off them. It was an astonishing notion, and probably only Alan Pegler could have done it.
It was January 1963. In 40 years of service, the nation's favourite locomotive had covered millions of miles pulling an express passenger train, achieved 2 world records, and by the skin of its teeth survived the breaker's yard. Waving it on to the next stage of its career, the crowds must have wondered what Alan Pegler had planned for it. He planned to rebuild the legend of the Scotsman. He began by taking it back to Doncaster and restoring it to its LNER livery. The locomotive went into a shed at the old plant works and emerged 3 weeks later transformed, with its original apple green coat and its old number, 4472. Then he commissioned its portrait.
Flying Scotsman is having her portrait painted by Terence Cuneo. This is just a sketch for the oil painting, and Terence Cuneo works from that back in his studio. Looks terrific, doesn't she?
She did. This TV programme, narrated by Johnny Morris, one of the 60s most popular voices, showed that Pegler had inherited all the LNER's skills in keeping Flying Scotsman in the public eye. He had an agreement with British Rail that gave Flying Scotsman unique access to the rail network. From 1963 until 1968, he used the agreement to the full.
Well, very nice to be in on time and greeted by such a good crowd. There is nothing at all in the world like riding on a steam locomotive at speed. I think anybody who's been lucky enough to do it would admit that.
He started to send the locomotive on rail tours all over the country, and in doing so he brought Flying Scotsman to an entirely new audience of people who'd never seen it before. Crowds thronged the line side. People put pennies on the rails for Flying Scotsman to crush. Everyone wanted a memento, everyone wanted to see it.
I say, just look at the crowd. It's a bit embarrassing, isn't it, to be gawped at so early in the day? Come on, let's push on and make way for that ordinary-looking thing that's rattling up behind. All right, we're moving.
There's something almost wonderfully comic about Flying Scotsman running on British Railways in the 60s. This engine brought back to its 1920s condition, and it's like, it's like a snub to the Beeching era management, who really were white heat of technology merchants. Flying Scotsman simply defied that, and matters were made worse for the management of British Railways because Flying Scotsman was so popular.
You know, you can't turn engines round like you used to. Can't you? No. Turntables are dying out. Oh, because these diesel things can be driven from either end. They don't need to be turned round. Exactly. You know, all the fun is going out of life. I mean, this is one of the railway's best bits of theatre. It's better than the revolving stage at the London Palladium.
In the years between the wars, LNER had used the newspapers and newsreels to promote Flying Scotsman. Alan Pegler used television.
He knows what he's got, and he starts rebuilding the legend of Flying Scotsman because he immediately engages a professional PR company based in London, and they're easily as good as the LNER people were in the 20s. And you can see this from the kind of media they get, because within a couple of years of his ownership of it, it's on Blue Peter.
Well, this is the Flying Scotsman, the most famous steam locomotive in the world. And today, she's going to make her very last non-stop steam run to commemorate the old days of steam on the London to Brighton line. Well, the train is packed full of railway enthusiasts, but I've got special permission to ride on the footplate. So it's very nearly time to be off, so I better climb aboard.
A whole generation of people believed almost everything John Noakes said. So, you know, it must be true, the most famous locomotive in the world. And this marriage of media and the image of Flying Scotsman, the steam locomotive, as an important symbol of the steam age goes on right through until you get into 68, when they make the documentary of Flying Scotsman non-stop run from London to Edinburgh.
Right away.
Alan Pegler wanted to attempt a non-stop run in 1968 to coincide with the 40th anniversary of the world record run in 1928. It was going to be a national event. Large crowds were expected on the trackside, and the BBC responded to the nation's enduring love affair with the Scotsman by making a documentary about the attempt. They used 7 camera crews, including 2 helicopters, to shoot the programme.
The role of the BBC, I think, was pretty consistent from the moment when steam locomotives were really finally under threat. Before then, there were quite a lot of films made with the BBC saying, well, it's the end of these old timers and the new world has to come. It was that sort of idea in the 50s and into the 60s. Then when the steam locomotive was finally going, the tone changes, and a sense of not just nostalgia, a sense that something very, very beautiful was about to slip past all our fingers.
Well, I spent 47 years on the railways.
Yes.
And it's a big change from my days to what it is today. And that's what I've come for today, because I think I'm approaching 80. And I think it'll be last time I shall see a steam engine.
The passengers included some very special railway fans, including the author of Thomas the Tank Engine, the Reverend Wilbert Awdry.
I had a railway background, and quite naturally the interest transferred itself to my son, and when he was ill with measles at the age of 3, it was most natural for me to tell him stories about trains. And he said, "Daddy, what are the engines' names?"
That's the way.
And I invented names on the spur of the moment: Edward, Gordon, Henry. And so there it was.
Just like the Reverend's books, the BBC film was capturing a world that enthralled the public. But it was a world that was disappearing. No one was even sure that Flying Scotsman would make it to Edinburgh.
I did it then simply because I had a feeling that it would be impossible to do it if I left it another 10 years to try and do it on the 50th anniversary. And my goodness me, I was right, because there were, at the time we did it in 1968, there were 3 sets of water troughs left between London and Edinburgh.
Water troughs along sections of the track were used to scoop up supplies on the move, but they were fast being dismantled.
Well, this is the highly dodgy situation that I hoped we were not going to find ourselves in, that we are now in. We've had 2 rather poor pickups of water and only 1 good one out of 3. And it's really a question now as to whether to take the water that we have got laid on in reserve at Berwick-on-Tweed, or whether to take a calculated risk, I suppose is the term, and carry on beyond the point of no return and try and make Edinburgh.
You are aware, presumably, that there are 1,800 pints of beer on board?
Well, that would be a great help, of course, a great comfort. that we might be very glad of that. I'm glad you mentioned that. And I think she'd probably run very well on my day.
In the event, they didn't need the beer. Alan Pegler's calculated risk paid off, and Flying Scotsman pulled into Edinburgh in under 8 hours, a record for steam.